Wait, so you're telling me if I make games with you guys, I can't make games for other consoles? Yes. That's stupid. I'm not agreeing to that. Well, in order to make games for our console, you have to agree to these terms. Yeah, well, I'm taking my business nowhere. Hey, what's going on, guys? This is Poger coming at you with another video. So, when you think of a company that pushes hardware limits, who do you think of? Konami, Nintendo, Sunsoft? What about Color Dreams? Okay, this one I probably need to explain. So, Color Dreams actually had a lot of ambitions. They wanted to take the NES in places that it's never been before. They wanted to make a coprocessor that added more colors to the NES's palette. And they had this big project that they even got a movie license to produce. But before we talk about that, I want to talk about the history of Color Dreams and kind of how it started and how this project came about. Anyway, let's get started. So, if you were a third-party game company in the late 80s and you wanted to make console games, you really only had one option. There was the Sega Master System, but it was not doing well in the US, and it didn't make sense for most companies to make games for it. Your only real choice was the Nintendo Entertainment System. Nintendo was dominating the market at the time, and they knew they were in the front seat, so they imposed restrictions on game companies that wanted to make games for the NES. So what were the restrictions? For one, you could only make 5 games a year. Secondly, the game company had to agree to a 2-year exclusivity clause, meaning they couldn't make games for other consoles. And if that wasn't bad, the game company had to buy cartridges from Nintendo directly. Some companies were not a fan of Nintendo's harsh restrictions, but what could they do? They can't really take their business elsewhere because the competition isn't doing well, so companies had no choice but to comply with Nintendo's restrictions. In January of 1989, a game company called Color Dreams had big ambitions. Not only did they want to start making games for the NES, but they thought game companies were getting lazy and they wanted to focus on making high-quality games. The company even wanted to start making coprocessors that would expand the NES's on-screen color palette from 25 to 325. With that said, Color Dreams did not like Nintendo's policies and wanted to find a way to get around it. The NES had a lockout chip that would prevent games from booting if they weren't licensed by Nintendo. With some clever engineering, Color Dreams found a way to get around the lockout chip. To my understanding, Color Dreams managed to bypass the lockout by placing a shock on the NES when the cartridge is inserted. So for the first time ever, games could be published without abiding by Nintendo's policies. Now that they have an opening, it's time to develop games. Color Dreams was hoping that by selling the games at a lower price point, consumers would pass on officially licensed games in favor of their games. In November of 1989, Color Dreams released their first NES game, Baby Boomer. We're going to take a look at it. First thing I want to comment on, notice where it says copyright 1989 by Jim Moore. The reason I point this out is because Color Dreams didn't have a huge team of developers. So anyway, your goal is to keep the baby safe. You don't actually control the baby, you're the crosshair. You have to shoot away enemies and build bridges for the baby so they can reach their destination. It's creative and it's playable, but you can just tell by looking at it that it's very low quality. The frame rate's bad, the colors are all washed out, the graphics look very primitive for 1989 standards. The music is horrible. Listen to it. Overall, this is a pretty lousy game. Imagine passing on Super Mario Bros. For this. So what happened to the quality and the color palette that was promised to the consumers? Well, for one, Color Dreams didn't have the resources that official Nintendo licensees had. For example, Nintendo provided development kits to game companies that made games for their console. This made it easier for companies to make games for the NES, but since Color Dreams went around Nintendo, they were never provided with one. They were forced to do everything in-house. Because of their lack of experience and resources, it was much more difficult to make games, especially at the level of quality that they wanted. But to be fair, Color Dreams was still a new company, and Baby Boomer was only their first game. They went on and published more games that same year, but most of them suffered from the same problems. Poor music, poor frame rate, washed out colors, you already know. The games feel very low quality, as if they were made on a budget. But one game surprised me, Metal Fighter. It's an auto-scroller where you collect weapon upgrades. Speaking of which, the weapon upgrade system is interesting. In most games, when you collect a weapon, it's yours, but in this game, when you collect a weapon, you're transported to a minigame. You have to complete the minigame in order to earn the weapon. That's actually really unique, and I like that. I've never seen a game that forces you to work for your upgrades. Some of the weapons are also really cool, and this is ambitious for an unlicensed game company. Metal Fighter differs from the other Color Dreams games because, for one, the frame rate is good. Secondly, the music is actually pretty catchy. Take a listen. And finally, the graphics are okay for Color Dream standards. I especially like the parallax scrolling. But there are some problems. The music is repetitive, the graphics are too dark on some stages, and the levels have very few differences between each other. And again, compare this to Super Mario Bros. Which one would you rather play? Overall, when you compare this to a real game, it's not very good, but when you drop your expectations to what Color Dreams normally produces, this is alright. So, as much as I want to praise Color Dreams for this game, unfortunately I can't, because this game was not developed by Color Dreams, it was only published by them. So yeah, this was completely pointless. But maybe not. This game does look good on Color Dreams' resume, even if they only published it. So with all these games that Color Dreams was publishing, Nintendo took notice of their activity. They didn't like that Color Dreams was going behind their back, so Nintendo made an agreement with retail stores that restricted them from carrying unlicensed games. Now that Color Dreams was booted from retail stores, they were limited on where they could sell their games. So to make up for this, Color Dreams featured games in magazine articles and included toll-free numbers where you could call if you wanted to purchase a game. So due to poor sales and poor reputation, Color Dreams created the company Bunch Games and began releasing games under that alias. However, nobody was fooled because the games were still very poor quality. One of the games was Mission Cobra. I talked about this one 7 years ago, but I'll give you a brief summary. The graphics are bad, there's no music except for a buzzing sound, there's only 3 levels, and I mean look at it, it's obviously very poorly made. But like with Metal Fighter, I do see some ambition here. The weapon upgrades are really cool, and the frame rate is actually pretty good. So Bunch Games also published Galactic Crusader. It's basically Mission Cobra, but a little bit better. For one, there's music in this game, even on the title screen and the boss battles. Might not seem like much, but Mission Cobra didn't have any music whatsoever, so this is an improvement. Secondly, there's more than 3 levels in this game. The weapon upgrade system is basically the same, but now you have this mini spaceship that shields you from overhead projectiles and gives you a little more firepower. Overall, this is a big improvement over Mission Cobra, and you could almost call this one a game. But guess what? These 2 games were made by Sachin, not Color Dreams. However, one game that Color Dreams did make in-house was Castle of Deceit. Here you play as a wizard who's trapped in a castle and you have to help him escape. In some levels, you have to collect keys in order to get him out. In other levels, you have to platform through them. In some areas, you interact in a 2-dimensional world just like any other platformer, but in others, you can walk around in all directions like a beat-em-up. I feel like this game didn't need that, they should have stuck with 2D only. The controls are really slippery, it's so easy to fall off the platforms. The bad frame rate only makes this problem worse. Seriously, I feel like this game runs at like 3 frames per second. This is one of the worst I've seen. When you have really bad frame rate, it's much harder to get your jumps right because there's less frames to see where you're going. So anyway, you have this magic spell to fight off enemies, but the hitbox is really poor. It's really hard to hit your target. Honestly, I wish you could duck in this game, but you can't. There's nothing you can do against enemies that are too short. Speaking of which, some of the enemies have really trolly patterns and you can't kill them. I really wish you could shoot in multiple directions like up, but you can only aim left and right, so any enemies directly above you, there's nothing you can do about it. So the graphics in the first level are pretty good. There's a lot of color and detail here. I actually like the waterfalls specifically. But in Stage 2, it's hard to tell what's actually a platform you can jump on and what is just part of the background. Stage 2 in general is just so weird. The bottom part of the stage is a 3D-like playfield where your character can move in 8 different directions, but the top part of the stage is just a 2D platforming environment. It's so inconsistent and it doesn't feel right to me. Seems like Color Dreams tried to be too ambitious here. So overall, I think Color Dreams had the right idea on Stage 1. The platforming was easy to understand, and the graphics were nice. The rest of the game should have been identical to Stage 1, with some changes to the graphics and level layouts of course, but they tried to bite more than they could chew, and I think the controls are just too slippery and the frame rate is abysmal. If they fixed all these problems and kept the game more like Stage 1, this would have been playable. So, Castle of Deceit is the only title published by Bunch Games that was actually developed in-house. The rest of them were developed by other companies. The idea of making a new company to hide from their bad reputation could have worked if they didn't continue to publish poor quality games. So I just wanted to reiterate, the games developed by Color Dreams are full of problems. The ones that were developed by other companies, they're better, but they still don't compare to an official NES game. What happens to the high-quality games that they promised? None of these games impressed me at all, and I certainly wouldn't consider buying them over a licensed NES game like they wanted consumers to do. If they keep doing this, they're not going to be successful, especially because they no longer have the retail market to sell their games. So what can they do? Well, they came up with an interesting idea. So after their games continued to sell poorly and Nintendo blocked them off from the retail market, the CEO of Color Dreams, Dan Lawton, thought of an idea. He recently saw the movie Hellraiser and enjoyed it, and he thought this would be a great idea for a game. After getting his team on board with the idea, he negotiated and secured the license to Hellraiser. It's estimated that Color Dreams paid anywhere from $35,000 up to $50,000 in order to do so. Dan Lawton envisioned a game that would use an improved version of the Wolfenstein 3D engine, which is a game where you move around in a 3D world. The problem, this was greatly above the NES's capabilities, and Lawton knew that, so he hired an engineer to work on a super cartridge, as they called it. This super cartridge would finally implement some of the features in their games that Color Dreams wanted from the start. So this super cartridge contained a Z80 processor, programmable array logic chips, and an extra 4 megabytes of RAM. Let's compare this. The NES used a 6502 microprocessor, which clocks in at about 1.75 MHz. The Z80 processor used in the super cartridge, however, clocked in at anywhere from 2.5 up to 10 MHz. The super cartridge's 4 megabytes of RAM didn't seem like much, but this is 1990. The NES natively came with only 2 kilobytes of RAM, so this is a gigantic upgrade. The super cartridge allowed the NES to perform tasks that it couldn't before. It supported more colors on screen, sprite manipulation, fully animated backgrounds, and more. The super cartridge allowed for the manipulation of video in real time and individual pixels on screen. This allowed Color Dreams to make the game the way they wanted, even if the NES couldn't natively handle it. So during the development of this game, a few articles talked about the upcoming release, including one that talked about the advanced technology, even referring to it as a 16-bit game. The magazine articles give us a few things to work with. For example, we have pictures of the box, the cartridge, and a gameplay picture of the title screen. Color Dreams was hoping that the movie license and superior capabilities of the game would drive sales, but they ran into problems during development. The hardware specs that I listed above all look great, but there's one thing we didn't talk about: the cost. The hardware required to make the super cartridge was expensive. They would have had to have increased the price in order to compensate for the high production costs. For example, if you sell a cartridge in store for $50, but the hardware inside costs $100, you're going to lose money charging only $50 for this game. You would have to increase the price by at least $100 in order to make a profit. The second thing, Color Dreams didn't have a lot of ways to sell this game. They had magazines, but they no longer had the retail stores. The movie license is nice, but it doesn't matter if people don't know this game exists. Unfortunately, the magazine pictures are all we have. The game was quietly cancelled, and we never got a release or even a prototype of this game. All the reasons I mentioned above most likely contributed to the decision to cancel the production and release of this game, but Dan Lawton did explain further during an interview. Here's what he said. There was a fatal flaw with the Hellraiser game for Color Dreams. It was the wrong sort of game for that company, and the machine, that meant it was doomed from the start. Just think about it. Color Dreams makes a game about a bloody nightmare? Doesn't work. The company was being managed by people who had never played a video game and never would, and were not strongly attached to the Western culture which would produce a movie like Hellraiser. To expect them to produce a game which was gory enough, sick enough, and mean enough to fit the movie is to expect too much. To expect anybody to produce it on a Nintendo is even worse. So it's unfortunate that we don't have any gameplay videos or even screenshots of what the gameplay looked like. Had this game been released, however, I'm fairly confident it wouldn't have been very good. The games that Color Dreams developed in-house are extremely low quality. They just didn't have the resources or team to make a good game. I don't see how they would have been able to turn this around with this game. Look at the title screen. It's hard to tell in this picture, but the artwork just looks like something Color Dreams would normally make. It just doesn't look good. I can't imagine how the rest of the game would have looked. So, despite the failures of Hellraiser, Color Dreams would move on to future projects that worked out better for them. They released Menace Beach, which I covered in my Maxi 15 episode. The controls are bad, the frame rate's awful, but it's actually a decent platformer, and this one was actually developed in-house, so I consider this the best Color Dreams game. Later on, Color Dreams finally found a way to sell their games without Nintendo interfering. They created the company Wisdom Tree, which would specialize in religious games, and they would be sold in Christian bookstores. This was a market that Nintendo never got involved with, so Color Dreams, or rather Wisdom Tree, finally found a way to get around them. They released their first game under the Wisdom Tree name, Bible Adventures, which became one of their best-selling games. Color Dreams wanted to take the NES in directions it had never been before, but they didn't have the resources or team to do so. Despite their promise to make high-quality titles, we instead received games that were quite the opposite. And when Nintendo cut them off from the retail market, they tried to make a movie-based game, but the project just would have been too expensive, and Color Dreams just didn't have the team to make this a reality. The name Color Dreams is very fitting because they had a lot of ambitions, but most of it was just wishful thinking. Hey, thanks so much for watching, guys. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like rating. It only takes a second and it gets my video noticed by more people. Also, if you enjoy my content, drop a subscription, that way you'll be notified when my next video comes out. Plus, it's completely free. Finally, drop a comment if you have any questions, suggestions, or just want to share your gaming experiences. This greatly helps the YouTube algorithm, and I'm usually pretty good at replying back. Anyway, have a good one, guys.